Welcome to our episode today. Today we will explore one of the most important and fascinating spiritual issues, how the prison of the mind and emotions keeps us trapped, and how we can experience self-realization and liberation. The theme, therefore, revolves around the prison of the mind and emotions, awakening disidentification, self-realization and liberation. What is the prison of the mind and emotions? Before self-realization, man lives trapped in the so-called prison of mind and emotions. What do we mean by this? Yes, before we begin, I want to make it clear that although the channel is spiritual, what we say is based on logic. That is, if it is not understood, do not believe it. The prison of the mind, then, is the vicious cycle of thoughts and feelings based on identification with the ego. In our daily lives, most people are completely identified with their body, mind, and desires. When, for example, a desire for some physical satisfaction arises, this creates thoughts and fantasies, which awaken and enhance the physical sensations. This cycle continues, and the person remains trapped in this constant search for pleasure and enjoyment. The problem is that, at this stage, man does not know that there is anything beyond the mind and the senses, that is, consciousness itself. Thus, the individual remains trapped in this mental and emotional cycle and identifies with his ego. The ego, or the sense of a personal self, thinks it makes decisions and controls life. This is the character most people identify with. Thoughts, feelings, personality traits, and memories seem to define them. It is simply a set of thoughts and identifications that have accumulated over time. The ego is the sense of me, that illusion of the separate person that one believes to be the mind, body, and personal identity. The ego exists only as thoughts and takes action to satisfy the needs of the body and senses. The ego, identified with the body, is constantly acting to satisfy the needs of the body and the senses. But this cycle of action desire is endless and based on ignorance, that is, ignorance of the real nature of the self. Identification with thoughts is the main cause of the illusion of the ego. When thoughts arise, there is a tendency to think of them as ours, as something that defines us or that we control. This identification creates the feeling of a separate self that thinks, I am my thoughts or I am the thinker. But consciousness itself is free from all identity. The mind tends to trap consciousness in this identification with thoughts, creating the feeling that I am what I think. The thought that I am the thinker is essentially the root of identification with the separate self, that is, with the ego. Thoughts seem to belong to this ego, and in this way the ego becomes something distinct and personal. This belief creates the illusion of an individual self, a subject who experiences, controls, and directs life. When you stop identifying with the thought that I think, you notice that life still flows, thoughts still appear, decisions still made, but all without the need for a separate controller. The self as we know it is simply a construct of the mind. Thoughts create not only the sense of a separate self, but also feelings, perceptions, and experiences that seem very, very real. Thoughts and feelings are closely related, as one feeds off the other. Thoughts create feelings. When a thought arises, it can immediately cause an emotional impact. For example, if you have a thought, I'm not good enough, that thought can cause anxiety, sadness, or fear. The mind creates a scenario and the body reacts by producing the corresponding emotions. Once an emotion arises, it can trigger more thoughts that in turn reinforce the emotion. For example, a feeling of fear can lead to more thoughts that intensify that feeling, such as, what if I fail? Or I can't handle this. Thus, a vicious circle is created between thoughts and feelings. This cycle is reinforced by identification with thoughts and feelings. When you believe that I am the one who thinks, or I am the one who feels, feelings and thoughts become very personal. This identification makes the experience seem more intense, more real, and more painful. Imagine that you have a thought that causes anxiety. The body immediately reacts, increasing heart rate, adrenaline flow, etc. This physical feeling can cause more worrying thoughts, such as, what will I do if things go wrong? Thus, the anxiety is amplified and you seem to be trapped in it. Also, we think we are the body, but the body works automatically, and this is true of many of its functions such as breathing, blood circulation, thoughts, and reactions. Everything is done without the intervention or control of the mind. These things happen spontaneously, without you having to think about them or direct them. They are part of the natural functioning of the body and life in general, without the existence of a central ego self directing them. Thoughts come spontaneously, as does breathing. The action occurs naturally, like the movements of the body during breathing. To think that there is a separate self is also just a thought. It is an idea, a mental construct created by the mind. When you believe that I am my body, my thoughts, my experiences, then the feeling is created that you are something separate from the rest of the world. This feeling is the source of separation, fear, and insecurity, as the ego feels vulnerable and alone. So the ego is not something that has a substantial existence. It is an idea, a concept created by the mind through thoughts. This idea is so strong and deeply rooted that we believe it without questioning it. This self that we imagine to be enclosed in our body and mind is actually a temporary construct, like a role in a play. The ego appears and disappears every moment. For example, when you are in deep dreamless sleep, the ego does not exist, but consciousness still exists. But when you wake up, the mind recreates its sense of self, along with its history and role in life. Indeed, the question, how come we do not exist? It arises because on the one hand, we feel the intense presence of our self, our thoughts, feelings, history, but on the other hand, we hear that this self, the ego, is not real. The truth is that you exist, but you are not what you think you are. You are not this personality with the police ID and the story your mind is telling you. So awakening is the solution to this trap. How does awakening relate to this situation? How does awakening happen and what changes? Awakening is the first step to freedom. In awakening, the individual begins to recognize that he is not just his body, thoughts, and emotions, but something much deeper, consciousness. This awareness is our true self, which observes everything but is unaffected by thoughts or desires. Awakening is a moment of recognition. You see that there is something beyond the ego, and this recognition breaks the illusion that we are trapped in the vicious circle of the mind. It does not mean that all desires disappear immediately, but the strong identification with them begins to dissolve. You talked about de-identification. What exactly is disidentification and how does it help after awakening? What does de-identification mean? How does it relate to awakening? Disidentification is the next stage after awakening. It is the practice and process of gradually withdrawing your identification from ego, thoughts, and desires. You begin to notice that you are not your thoughts, you are not your body, and you are not your desires. The process of disidentification from the ego is a critical step towards self-realization. As one realizes that the ego is merely a worker for one's body and desires, one understands that the higher self is free from all this. This understanding leads to inner freedom and peace as we stop chasing the temporary gratifications of the ego and turn our attention to the real, immortal self. For example, when a desire for some physical pleasure arises, instead of identifying with it and following it, you observe it. Instead of letting it control you, you recognize that this desire is just a thought or feeling that comes and goes within the space of awareness. This detachment is the beginning of freedom from the vicious circle of the mind. It is important to note that avoidance of sense objects does not mean complete abstinence from life, but disidentification from dependence on them. You can continue to live in the world, but without being controlled by desires and senses. What is the final stage of this process, and how do we reach self-realization? Self-realization is the final stage of the spiritual path. In self-realization, the individual fully experiences and identifies with consciousness. This means that the individual is no longer identified with the ego, mind, or desires, but remains constantly in a state of recognition of his true nature as infinite consciousness. In self-realization, awareness is not just something you recognize occasionally. It becomes the way you live and experience reality. Desires, thoughts, and bodily sensations may still occur, but they no longer control you. You are free from the vicious circle that held you captive. What happens after self-realization? What does the experience of liberation look like? After self-realization, there is the experience of liberation. In this state, you are free from the illusion of the ego and the cycle of desires and thoughts. Desires and sensations may still arise, but you are now detached from them. They don't affect you psychologically. Fullness is something that is constantly experienced, not because of external conditions, but because of the unchanging nature of consciousness. The feeling of emptiness and the need for external satisfaction disappears. You are free and complete from within, without seeking happiness in the phenomena of the world. Through disidentification, we gradually move away from the illusions of ego and mind. And in self-realization, we find complete identification with consciousness. Ultimately, in liberation, we live free from the cycle of desires and the need for external satisfaction. Thank you for joining us on today's episode. If you enjoyed the discussion, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with anyone you think can benefit from this discussion. created by Elias Stasinos. Until next time, live with awareness and freedom. Hit the like button and subscribe if you found this helpful.